And I'm going to go ahead and pull up this paper. And this is very intriguing. How a different approach to understanding the success of Black science majors at primarily white institutions, of which you and I both teach at.
Yes.
The methodology of this is very interesting to me. And when I first started reading this, I wondered, you know, n equals 34, what are we going to get out of 34 students that would be meaningful? Mm-hmm. And is it almost not fair to say, oh, this is the model for how Black students succeed, like all Black students are the same or something, right? But then when you get into it, it's the way that this is approached that I think makes this work. This idea of an anti-deficit achievement approach, which they do a nice job explaining.
Yeah, they do.
Community cultural wealth. So the anti-deficit achievement approach, first of all, basically framing the questions not as, oh, why are you bad at this, but why are these people good at this? So the example they have here, rather than why do so many Black students leave science majors, but change it to why do Black students persist in science majors despite all known barriers? So just that idea of taking the question and reframing it gives us an idea about, as I say here, strengths and assets. What is being done to allow these students to succeed? It's worth mentioning right out of the gate, this was all done at the University of Georgia. Research intensive, primarily white institution. The rules vary a little bit at the smaller institutions that you and I work at, possibly. But this gives, I think, a decent framework. And also, because of the size of the institution, gives you the chance to get, you know, a critical number of students that you could go in and get information from. So I think that's certainly a positive. So they mention here external and internal factors promoting the persistence of Black students in STEM. A significant amount of time here is spent on the positive environment that HBCUs can provide. This was very interesting for me, I think. I mean, to freely admit, I didn't understand the purpose that HBCUs served until I, talked to several people who had been to them, and it's enlightening for me to understand that, right? The idea of having that background where one does not feel like they are isolated. That it frees that, frees those anxieties up and allows you to concentrate on being a scientist. And so I definitely appreciate that now in a way I didn't before. And the idea about having opportunities just for people to get together and form their own groups to have greater achievements. Some things here I think persist beyond race or other types of groups. Using active learning methods, for instance, helps you do better. That's not news to us. We've seen that across, I think, all groups. And then here for internal factors, discussing the idea of self-confidence, science identity. Again, I don't think these are necessarily race specific, but they certainly allow for a degree of persistence that needs to be considered. And so this is all going to be looked at under the grounds of community cultural wealth. I was not familiar with this framework. I was familiar with cultural capital, the idea that some people get to college and know, like for instance here, we're doing our summer research applications right now. And so do people know to ask a professor about doing research? Do people understand the value of doing an independent research project? Things like that relate to the idea of cultural capital. If you're brand new to college, if you've never been in an academic environment, do you understand the culture of the academic environment? And this is asserted, this is my joke at the beginning, under critical race theory, of the idea of deficit thinking. And so here's the quote: takes the position that minority students and families are at fault for poor academic performance because of this lack of cultural knowledge. And so just like the anti-deficit model from before, this takes that idea and flips it on its head. And so we see here the forms of capital, community, cultural wealth. And so you've got 6 different categories: aspirational, navigational, resistant, linguistic, familial, and social. This would just simply be, what are the positives that are being used in a given group to help people succeed? So what can you do, even when there's barriers present, that allows you to overcome those barriers and to succeed? So that gets to the idea of navigational capital, the idea of hopes and dreams not being dashed by these barriers, challenging oppression or inequality. The linguistic one, I think, is fascinating. We did talk a lot about code sharing in here, or not code sharing. What's the word I'm looking for? We'll get to code switching, code sharing.
Which is very interesting to me, because honestly, I never thought about that.
Yeah. Code switching. I thought that was really, I read that with great detail, because I'm like, I almost feel like I've seen examples of that, but yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. Familial capital, so extending your family and friends, and then social capital, just having those, that social skill set. So this was done with a pair of interviews, a fall interview, a spring interview. The idea of participatory action research. So in other words, we're bringing together people who are actually in this group that are involved to get information from them. So that's the technique. And not only are they looking at 2 different interviews, they also use this approach. So data collection here, card elicitation, to get information. So participants presented with 5 different stacks of cards, and then picking, I think I'm mixing up a couple of these things. Select the cards containing the ideas that resonated with them. So basically cues that allowed people to think about what particular aspects of these capital wealth are actually giving them success. So I may not be able to categorize like, oh, resistant capital, I wouldn't know what that was, but I can have some clue ideas here, right? Ideas that are given to me. And upon reflection, I could say, oh, that is meaningful to me. That's something that I relate to. And then finally, this photo elicitation project, the idea of submitting photographs or a short video reflecting to their own ideas. So just another medium on which the students can present how they feel. So here are our students, the 34 of them, almost all biologists, a couple biochemists. There's a physical scientist scattered in there too. It looks like a typical female majority group that you see in the life sciences nowadays. And then self-reported identity, a mix of African-American from other countries. Nigerian shows up multiple times, and then African-American or Black, depending on how they report themselves. So up to this point, Mindy, I guess I would ask you for your own sort of reflections on, have you had exposure to this kind of study before, or has anything been done maybe with DEI efforts at Washington College or on your own experiences to address these sort of questions?
I mean, so as I was reading it, I mean, I was really fascinated, first of all, by their approach, because I think their approach was really different. Since that kind of got me right from the beginning. I was like, I feel like we all look at it from the negative, like how can they not succeed, and not looking at it from the positive.
Yeah,
so that
exactly.
sort of like got me in right there.
The anti-deficit, that was a new term for me.
No, it was totally new.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking about, I mean, obviously we were primarily white institution, very few students of color. I mean, we have some, but I started to think about the different unions that we have, like, we have the Black Student Union, we have Cleopatra, we have lots of them. and started thinking about the students who identify with those, and I'm thinking about them more less as clubs, but now more of like support systems for
Right.
these students for success. So I guess I was trying to think about them in a different way than I've looked at them in the past.
Yeah, me too.
And interestingly enough, I mean, there's been a lot of initiatives on my campus to diversify the faculty as well as the student body. And I'm seeing now why they're saying, of course, students, they feel more comfortable, they feel like they can relate. That being said, I don't think students understand how hard it is to diversify a faculty. And it's not because you don't try, it's also because you can't always get faculty to want to come to particular areas, especially, I mean, you probably have the same problem. I mean, we're considered to be the South, and they're definitely, the town that I'm in might not be as accepting as it should be.
We've had the same thing. It's like, why do you keep hiring the same people? I'm like, we're not trying to, like, we're legitimately trying, but like, it is very hard to be first, right, in certain situations, or tokenism or things like that. And yeah, it's an uphill battle.
And then, I mean, maybe this is new for myself in the last couple of years, but I have been becoming more aware of I think I'm very good at like treating all students equally, but I'm also becoming aware to make sure that I'm not favoring,
Right.
I'm actually more worried that I favor students of diversity over other students because I'm trying to compensate. And I know for a fact that I'm not doing it. I've done very conscious effort.
I've had the same thought, like, am I deliberately interacting with a minority student in some kind of weird way because I want to show like, oh, look, I'm not racist, I'm not doing that. And in the process, like basically branding myself a racist, you know?
Exactly, or those ideas. And I was very interested in say about the code switching, but I'm also always very concerned, and I'd love to have more of a conversation about this idea of microaggression, because I know people talk about it. I don't know if I myself know when people are, and I don't think this applies to race, actually. I think this can apply to lots of different situations of being microaggressive.
Oh yeah.
I don't really know when this might occur, and more importantly, how I in a classroom could manage microaggression, because maybe I'm not as aware of it as I should be.
I have a fairly large laboratory class this semester. It's actually 2 different classes rolled into one for reasons I will not bore you with right now. But all the minority students have brought themselves into one group. And I certainly didn't plan for that. And it just sort of organically happened. And they're all very good students. I like them all very much, but that was an interesting dynamic that they sort of found each other and put themselves together. And never said a word about it, just something I mentally noted. And this paper alludes to potentially doing, I don't do a lot of pre-group formations in my classes, but it suggests that in this case to avoid exactly the scenario that just played out and is playing out in my class. We had a group of prospective students in yesterday, all white, and I just scattered them around this room, and one of them was with the 3 Black students. And like, I was just curious. I'm like, is he uncomfortable? Because, and maybe that's just me again projecting my own thoughts on that, but these are dynamics that I don't know if I would have noticed before, but I notice now. And this paper helps me think about that and maybe consider how I could improve that. What is Cleopatra, by the way, as you mentioned that?
Oh my God, let me look it up so I could like.
I have a guess. It must be a female organization.
Yes, it's a female. Yeah.
I will say while you're doing that, we had a student a couple years ago come to me and say, we need a minority public health association. And I was very skeptical of that because I'm like, well, what are the numbers we have, right, to actually put something together like that? But I thought of that. It was brought to my head when you started talking about the way you think of those organizations. And I'm like, what you said combined with this paper, like, oh, even if it was 2 or 3 people, it's sort of what they're talking about in here of sort of building of capital or development of relationships that would be really important to help keep you in the field, even if it is only 3 people or something like that. So.
Yeah, they say, I mean, I know the students. So Cleopatra's, it's a sisterhood without a sorority, and it's specifically focused on women and women of color. And they come together for like community service, empowerment, they say.
Okay.
And it says very clear here, support within and outside the classroom.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it goes beyond STEM, just women in general.
Yeah, it's women in general. And I do not know if there's like one for the males. I don't think that there is, which makes me kind of then wonder is, do males feel differently than females is what they're saying here. I couldn't quite tease that out. It's hard because there's a lot of females.
Yeah,
clearly.
and I don't think they tried to do that. I think there's certainly, so being in an all male institution, one thing I see that's interesting is that sometimes, there are the privileges of being male when it comes to some of the societal rules. I find sometimes the men here get very pressured because they feel like because they are men, they have to provide, they have to succeed or else. There's sort of pressure, and I don't know where it comes from, if it's from their parents, if it's from just themselves, if it's from society, but it is something that I notice just because we are in this unique environment here where it is overwhelmingly male. There's a small handful of women who are daughters of faculty staff, but it's almost all completely male. And so you just see that dynamic play itself out in a way that I don't think plays out in a lot of places.
So as I was looking for this, I was trying to decide, like I was trying to come out of these papers and be like, well, what can I do with it? Like, how can I apply this? And it's interesting, you just said that about my students also self-select into labs and like they pick their own lab partners. And now that you said that, in my class of 18, sorry, it's a small class this semester, I have 4 students of color and they all sit together on the bench. So that's interesting now that I realize that. But I'm trying to think what I can do with this. Like, I don't know. I mean, I know the takeaway message, I guess. Is it just being more aware, or is there something which I can actively use to make myself better?
It's funny you say that, because as I'm halfway through the paper, I'm like, how is this paper going to end? I'm actually really curious, because if it's just identifying these themes, like what is like I was looking forward to the discussion because I'm like, what are they going to say besides, hey, here's what we found?
Yeah.
And they do give some suggestions which we can get to here.
Yeah, I mean some, but I guess I didn't really find them helpful.
Yeah, fair enough. So they do some coding and they put things into these major themes. And so just to highlight what they got here, number 1, using their capital to navigate the racial climate. And so this is where they start to talk about the code switching, I believe. The racial climate at a PWI, navigating the racial climate through code switching, and challenging the racial climate through resisting capital. So 3 different forms of capital, sort of understanding where people are, figuring out where to get support. The development, okay, this is where the microaggressions come into play. And I'm really glad they put some examples in here. So there's the example of the girl in the lab who had to do the pipette refilling duty all the time. And the idea of she being asked to do that because she was the Black student, like whether the student or whether the grad student meant that or not. Just intriguing to think about, like what, how these forms play out. There's some more examples of overt racism, but those get dealt with in a different way with the resistant capital. This one at the bottom, I think, is an interesting quote, because I think I fall victim to this sometimes. I notice a lot of times when I go to certain places, some people just assume I have to be a first-generation college student. My grandparents went to college. And do I assume when I have a Black student, for instance, that that student comes from a deprived background? Because I have certainly had my fair share of students who are people of color, but come also from an upper class background. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think sometimes maybe I have to correct myself.
Yeah.
It's an idea about that. And so that quote struck me in terms of thinking about ways I think I might have done stuff. Then we get in here to the code switching. So the idea of linguistics that are different depending on who you talk to. It seems exhausting in the sense that you would have to think about the way you would talk to one group or another, or deliberately change the way you address people based on who they are. I like the way it's described as capital here, because it would be at the beginning, you either have it or you don't. It's a skill, right? It's a phenomenon I'd like to know more about. I mean, this is something, just seeing the quotes here from the students, and how it actually, this person here just not even thinking about doing it, but
I think we all code switch. I mean, like, I obviously talk to different people differently. So is this really related to race? I mean, it could be, but I think that it also happens all the time.
Well, maybe like a particular, in the case of the code switching here with respect to talking to power dynamic is what I'm trying to say. Like code switching in a power dynamic versus a more casual version of it, maybe. Because I think you're right. I think certainly I could think of things I would say to a friend or a family member that I wouldn't just say to a student, that the way I talk to my students is going to be in different form. I think what the argument here would be is that it's more essential, for lack of a better way of saying it. As it mentions here, dialects, the way you would talk in community. And some of it would be stereotypical. And I could see the concern, if you're from the South, do you deliberately not try to speak in a drawl when you're having a scientific conversation? Is that something our students do? I've never really thought about it. I'm not from the South, but is that another form of code switching that could occur? And then there's this example here, code switching with respect not to language, but to hair, the idea of braids and a hairstyle and what the effect of a hairstyle would have in one group or another. Are there stereotypes with respect to appearance? And is there a need to change appearance in one environment or another? And then in context with that, educating people, I've read about this in terms of trying to not exhibit racist behavior, like the onus shouldn't be on people of color to have to always explain to people what they're doing. At the same time, if there's something to be corrected, are you assertive enough to mention the issue and try to resolve the issue? So there's some complicated dynamics in there that I, just in my own backgrounds, I'm not going to understand as much as other people, to be honest. But this is it's a very provocative article, because every paragraph made me think about something different. Checking people, like that idea, like some people automatically shut off when you say check your privilege or something like that, but checking people sort of falls into that same idea, a way to just explain when something has gone wrong. Okay, so major theme number 2, internal strengths as navigational capital. This one doesn't necessarily have to be related to race, right? How motivated are you? What keeps you going? What is your drive? What is your persistence? Number 4 is the big one here in my environment, willingness to ask for help. That's another one that I think has some gender attachments to it, that in my limited experience, since I've taught mostly male students for 13 years now, I have a whole subset of students who really, really don't want your help, because then they're not independent and they are, I think, less than. And so that is something that I have tried to, when helping students with metacognition, with thinking about study skills, things like that, the getting over shame aspects, if they exist, in terms of like, it's okay, we don't all know everything, you know? Have you had experiences here with your subsets of students in terms of that motivation and persistence?
I mean, I've always found like my females in general to be much more persistent. And sometimes when I say, come and see me, or I ask them to come and see me. And again, I phrase it very differently now. I'm not like, oh, if you've done poorly, you should come and see me, because I don't want them to think they've done anything like wrong. but like it is my males who are more, they're just more hesitant to come in and see me.
I
I
think
don't
that's
know. I
true.
mean, it's also with my children. Like my female child is like all about like, you know, coming and self-improvement, where my boys are just like, they keep it in, they don't really care, they move on. So like, I don't know.
It's interesting. I mean, and I think sometimes, I think it's because we like order and we like things to make sense. Sometimes we're very quick to assign this to, oh, that's what guys do. Oh, that's what people in a certain racial group do, or things like that. Whereas some of these, especially with this internal strengths, could very much be just individual study or individual persistence in terms of how they get places.
Mm-hmm.
Self-motivation, I think, is really interesting. I have certain students here that sort of take, we joke at the Michael Jordan approach. If you don't have an enemy, create an enemy, even if the enemy doesn't really exist. And that's what motivates you. I've watched some people, let's say somewhat detrimentally to themselves, do behavior like that.
That's so fun.
It's weird. It's weird, but it works for some. And then number 3. Social capital to create spaces. This one was cool. The idea of BUGA, Black UGA. And this is where you and I were talking about those organizations. Like, where are the spaces where you can not coordinate, console, conspire, all the words you would need to share navigational capital. So what has the senior learned that he or she can teach the freshman about UGA, right? What do I need to do? Who are the people who maybe are going to be more sympathetic on the faculty or staff? Where do I go if I need help on something? All of these things are going to be not necessarily obvious from a brochure, from a website. And so the idea of creating spaces would be, I mean, one presentation here of something that could be very helpful. Again, I think sometimes we look at groups and it's like, oh, it's the Black group, the Asian group, the Hispanic group. And it's like, why are people segregating themselves? If you can get a group where people have had a common experience and use that common experience to educate each other and help the group succeed, then the existence of those groups makes a lot more sense when put in that context. So I definitely appreciated this. And we, even at our tiny institution here, have these spaces where people can help each other from a position of minority, that they can figure out how to navigate a place like this that, I mean, being in Virginia didn't have minority students at all prior to 50 years ago, right? And now we get to the discussion, and you had mentioned like some of it was interesting. We're not sure how maybe helpful it is, but the framework to me is super interesting. I'm usually not a theoretical person. That's just my personality, but like the framework here of community cultural wealth. We've had so many discussions in society, most unhealthy, about critical race theory in the last 6 months, and seeing an application of it here with respect to how to positively look at the capital that a minority group would have, or what advantages or strengths a minority student could bring to bear in a primarily white environment to help them succeed. I think that framework is actually super useful here in helping us to understand. These guys were as interested in code switching as we were. The idea of the linguistic challenges, how one speaks to one group versus another, to be able to, not, as they say here, not just succeed, but thrive. Like, what can one do to find opportunities, use that capital, and indeed cultural capital too. I know that's discounted sort of at the beginning, but understanding the academic environment and how to navigate the academic environment. I would put the cultural capital under some of that navigational community capital they're talking about here as being something you would want to consider. And then for us, faculty, can we recognize this? Can we reflect? I know we've been talking about this just for the last half hour, you and I, examples that we have noted in our own classes, and not necessarily things to correct, but just dynamics to observe, things to file away for the future of what can you do, just subtly, but also with deliberation, to make sure you're not inadvertently closing people off, that you are not. I'll give you an example actually in my class right now. We just had our first genetics and cell biology exam, and it didn't go great. I'm not gonna lie. We can have that whole sub conversation everyone's been having for a year now about the COVID sort of screwing up a couple years worth of students.
Yep.
And this, I think, manifests itself in this exam I just gave. And I want to learn more about ungrading. I've got the book. I haven't read the book yet. I'm giving the students the opportunity to correct the exam.
Wait, what's the name of the book?
Ungrading.
Oh my gosh. Don't even get me started on that. My husband and I we both read it. Yeah. We're very frustrated. There's some things in there that like really make me angry.
Oh, why is that? Because I haven't read it yet. Give me the spoiler alert.
It's just the idea of like, well, I mean, basically it's, if you grade it one way, you're kind of gearing it towards one group versus the other. And this idea of reassessment. I mean, like you can reassess some things. I get that, like a lab report. I just gave them bad graphs. They didn't do them very well. So I'm like, why don't we fix them? So that's a skill I want you to get.
Yeah.
But like for a test, I'm kind of like, no, like we're not gonna like reassess this. But of course, my son just didn't do well on a test, and what do I want him to do? I want him to reassess. And he's in 6th grade, but they're 6th graders.
Yeah. This particular exam, I wanted to give them a chance to not get all the points back. We're not talking about everyone getting an A here, but enough people did poorly on it that I wanted a chance for them to go back and really learn the material. And so I did want to give them that chance in this situation. I don't know if there's a universal answer to it. Situationally, it seemed like a good idea for me in this case. But I appreciate that, right? That there are differences between different styles of assessments and sort of the maybe traditional stakes or psychology one attaches to them. Anyway, I haven't read the book yet. And so it's good to hear like that sort of, I mean, not that I expected it to be like the Bible or something, but just to have those
really
ideas.
good things in it. There really is, but there was just some things I was just like, I don't know if I buy that.
In any event, so recognizing when there are opportunities to have maybe those classroom moments when they mention here the pre-assigning of groups to avoid people being picked last or neglected. Totally see that is something I have thought about in terms of, I've got a couple really smart students that actually also have significant learning disabilities. So there's an ableist side to this too, that people don't want to work with them because of that, but they're also really brilliant. And so that is another thing that we could look at in terms of a group that doesn't always get treated fairly, that you would have to think about here as well. Okay. So anyway, I sometimes, we get nervous around issues like this or topics like this, but I found this just very provocative. And when a paper makes me think about what I do that much, it must be doing something right, So.
Yeah, no, it really made me think. I need to read more papers like about this. I think it's good to become aware as being somebody at PUI, being white, being a female in the discipline. But I also want to make sure I have equity. Like I don't want to favor certain students over the other by compensating. Yeah.
So I'm sorry we didn't have a bigger group today, but even this discussion just with the two of us, I think is very helpful. Just hearing how you do things or how I do things and some of the commonalities we have, which is actually very encouraging.
Yeah, it's nice. And the fact that my students did very poorly on their first exam is also encouraging.
I didn't completely fail since a teacher, right?
No, exactly. We're all normal, right?
All right. I really appreciate you being here today, Mindy.
Thanks. Have a good rest of your week.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.